All right, good afternoon. That's the spirit. Love that. Thank you for taking your time joining a session on troubleshooting and debugging OS deployment with Config Manager 2012. As you can see on the screen, feel free to shoot questions through Twitter. I'm trying to monitor the feed on a second laptop that I have on stage. I will probably not be able to answer them all during the session because we normally turn out to be like 100. But I promise I will reply to them before the end of the day. So if you have any questions, just type them in, and I will, after the session, continue and go ahead and answer them. Also, I love questions in general, so at any time, just raise your hand, yell out the question, I will repeat it, and I will answer it. My name is Johan. I have been doing deployment for a long, long time. I've been an IT guy since I was about 10. But I waited until I was 16 where I actually started to work as an IT pro. And I'm close to 40 now, so you do the math. As you can hear from my accent, I'm not a native American. I live in Europe. I live in Sweden. And no, we don't make chocolate. We don't make watches either. That's Switzerland. There is a difference. Zurich is very nice, but I live in Sweden. That's up north. All right. When you do deployments through Config Manager, most of you have seen this. This error code has a meaning, actually, which is really to the spot. The meaning of this error code is that whatever you were hoping for, you didn't get. This is just one of very many generic error messages saying something went wrong. We need to dig down, go into the log files, and find out why it happened. So, I assume, I'm being with friends in here, I assume that you guys at least have used either Light Touch or Config Manager or any combination so that you have a little bit of understanding around those deployment. This is a level 300 session. I expect some serious notepad skills and that you're not afraid of me being in a command prompt where I will be for a great part of this session. This is Config Manager. Ben Hunter did an excellent troubleshooting session on Monday on Light Touch, so if you missed that one, it's available on the digital MMS site, so you can just stream it and view it there. I had some challenges when preparing for this session because there are 3 sort of deep dive troubleshooting sessions at MMS this year, and I think that's a new record in some kind. But I found a way to present something to you that I think none of you have seen before. I hope that anyway. So, our pillars, basic troubleshooting skills, and then we simply dive into common issue after common issue after common issue until we solve the most common issues around OSD. So, when you got that error message, what you need to do in Config Manager is you need to find out why. You need to dive in and find the log files. And as you probably know by now, the Config Manager boot image, the 2012 boot image, has CMTrace built in. That's good. Even for the 64-bit image, even though I don't use it very often. But it's there if you need it. If you, for example, are building reference images in Config Manager, and you're building 64-bit ones, and you have a 64-bit boot image, you'll find CMTrace there as well. The point with the log files are, they are in different locations depending on when it breaks. If you do a bare metal deployment, and it fails quite early in the beginning, what will Config Manager do? Well, it will give you a prompt, something went wrong, and after 15 minutes it will reboot. This means if you start the deployment, you verify it starts, and then you go for coffee, talk to some friends, and you are back after, say, 17 minutes. When you come back, it will say boot manager is missing. The log files that could help you troubleshoot it, they were in RAM. They were in the X drive for a while, but the machine rebooted, so the log files are gone. So I will show you how we can change that behavior and not have config manager reboot that quickly on us. Because if there is an error big enough to the sequence to break, I would like to know about it. I just don't want the machine to reboot on me. If I do a refresh, well, when the log files will end up in the normal config manager client log file, and as of config manager 12, it's moved. It's now in the Windows CCM folder, 32 and 64-bit. In 07, it was in different places. But are we really toast if a bare metal deployment fails early in config manager? In light touch, we normally would be, but are we in config? No, not really. Because everything the sequence does generates, eventually, from time to time, status messages up to the server. And we can review those status messages either through reports or by simply querying for status messages. Unfortunately, at least I liked it. In config manager 07, that was a very quick way to see all the running deployments as status messages, and I just love that node. It's gone. So you have to query it yourself, but it can be done, so it's not that bad. I just missed that one. Ben told you, for those of you who attended, that in light touch, the main log file is BDD, but in config manager, the main log file is SMSTS log file, the sequence log file. Now, what's the problem with this log file? How big can it be by default? 1 meg, 1 megabyte. What happens when it grows beyond 1 megabyte? Creates a copy, an archive, and starts to fill up that one. How many archive copies does it keep? Unoas, 1. When you do a normal OS deployment, at the time the operating system is injecting drivers, you are already up in 3 megs of log files. Meaning, if something happened in the beginning that you want to peek later at, you can't, because it's overwritten, it's gone. But I will show you how to fix that as well. Turn out you can actually increase the size of this file. To get to these files, you simply find a command prompt, you hit F8, and you double check or review the log files in their location using cmtrace. The log file, in addition to the status messages, will report very detailed about what's happening. But in addition to the config manager logging, we can steal from MDT. Because MDT, when integrated with config manager, also have logging, and they also have features named SLShare and SLShare dynamic logging. What that really means, if it breaks, it will copy the log files back to the server to a share that you specify. I will show you that later. And not only the SMSTS log file, also additional log files that can help you troubleshoot. For example, the setup act log file. For example, the dism log file to troubleshoot drivers. More than config manager by itself normally would copy, but then help you troubleshoot what's going on. So let's start following a deployment. Yeah, I love Matrix. I've seen it an obscene amount of times. Probably not healthy. All right, so I have config manager running. I have my CMO1 config manager server. I have a few sequences. One says debug, one says doesn't. First, this one. This one is how you change it. Let me get zoom it. Hello, thank you. If you set this variable early in the beginning, I'm changing the default behavior for reboot. The value is in seconds, meaning 24 hours. So if it breaks, it will stop for a day before it reboots on me. And as I said before, if an error is severe enough for breaking, I would like to know about it. What about the log file then? How can I make it bigger than 1 meg? when I do bare metal deployments? Well, it turns out, I'm pretty sure it's not supported. But if you place an ini file in your boot image, named like this in the Windows folder, and the content looking like this, the client will read it and use it. And as you can see, this is actually 20 megs. I don't know if there is an upper limit, but I have not yet seen a sequence going beyond 10, a log file going beyond 10, so I figured 20 was safe. It might be able to crank it higher. But in doing this, I make sure I always have the full information in the log file for troubleshooting. All right, so let me find a client. And I will go to clean snapshot. And I will boot from a media, which I have prepared a little bit beyond the ordinary boot image. So it's loading PE now. It's WinPE version 3 still, meaning we still need to have Windows 7 drivers, etc. I'll come back to that later. But for this one to work, well, you need to have a deployment up and running on the server, and you need to have all packages available, etc. Look now. Shortly, you will see something happening that normally doesn't happen. Right there. Did you notice? It changed the screen resolution from the default 8 by 600 to 1024 by 768 because I find it easier to read the log files when I at least have a chance to see a full line in them. So how did I do that? Well, it turns out that if you place a well-crafted unattended XML file in the root of the boot image, it will use it. And if you look at my settings on this file, eventually, you will see I'm setting the screen resolution. This is a config manager boot image. And as you can see, I'm also taking advantage of actually just kicking a script that will stop the process even before the pre-execution hook in config manager itself, if I want to do stuff before config manager even thinks about starting. So go back to my client. I can now hit F8 to get a command prompt, and as you can see, I have adjusted it a little bit. Again, for the people in the sheep seats over there. Yes, Mr. Alex, sir. There's a good comment from Mr. Alex here. He's a Microsoft Consulting Services guy out of East Coast somewhere. Yeah. He has noted that the SMST's in file actually is supported. Superior. Great. Love that. All right. So I adjusted this information a little bit. If I go into the temp folder, whoop, that's not the temp folder. That's not the temp folder either. You can now see it's beginning to do logging, but it's not yet started to do anything real work. What I can do at this point is I can navigate to this folder. And I can start a script I wrote called startmon. Because those of you who've done light touch know that light touch has a pretty cool monitoring node. Meaning on the server, that's not the server. In light touch, you can see all running deployments side by side. But you can't do that with config manager yet. So I run this script. And you can see now in the left-hand corner eventually, it will launch a process. It will launch the Dart remote connection, which normally requires you to put in a ticket number, an IP address, and a port. And I know that Alex here on the front row, he actually wrote a script to produce a shortcut on the server. I did something quite similar. I published it to the web service that LightTouch is using. So if I go back to my server now, I have my config manual client available, and I can now remote into it directly from the server. So I don't have to run around, find the client, hit F8, get the log file. I can simply click it and get it. All right. So I will delete this entry, and I will show you another cool thing. If you are deploying virtual machines, you don't have to use Dart to connect to them. You can use the normal VM Connect that I'm using for connecting to VMs. The problem is Windows PE doesn't know the Hyper-V hosts until you start the integration services. And if you ever try to start them in a WinPE, you realize it didn't work at all, even if you install them. Because they are looking for the Windows Terminal Services service, remote desktop service, and it doesn't exist in WinPE. So therefore, the services doesn't start. Point is, it's not using that. So if you create a script that just creates a fake Terminal Services service in WinPE, before you install the integration services, which you can do through driver load, and simply point it to the in file that you get from the VM guest ISO or the VM guest folder in Windows. Just before I launch that command, I'm doing a net start, and you will see I have no Hyper-V services running. I will use driver load. Launch that in file again. It doesn't require a reboot, but now I have my services running. Even the Exchange service, which allows me to pass data between guests and hosts. I can have the host have something that the guest retrieves. And for example, it will now input the Hyper-V host name in the registry. So if I run my monitor script again, and go back to my server, I should now be able to do a VM connect to the machine. I need to specify an admin account. That's for the Hyper-V host. Hello. Normally it doesn't do that. Let's try again. Could be the screen resolution that we are having in these machines. Here we go. So now you can see I'm using virtual machine connection to remote into WinPE, even though I'm not at the actual Hyper-V host right now. And this could be very useful if you have a large data center where you have a bunch of Hyper-V hosts and you're not really sure which host is running which VM, etc. So you can use either of these methods, either the Dart remote control or the VM connection to remote into them. Yes, sir? That was the credential I entered. The question was, which credentials did I enter? That was the Hyper-V host credentials to connect to the using it for the VM connect command. Because I'm connecting from another server in another domain.
But there are no local credentials.
No local credentials in WinPE whatsoever. Doesn't exist. WinPE is just a dumb, sort of a Windows for Workgroup style machine without local accounts except for the system. But this allows you to go in and access the client without having to do so much. Also, what you can do to help troubleshoot is add pauses to the sequence when it's breaking. If you want to troubleshoot, for example, disk partitioning, it makes sense to add a pause to the sequence so it actually aborts and when it comes to that step. So let me reconnect back to my client again. And let me find the OK button. So it will continue. I will click Next. I will select the sequence. And off we go. It will now start running through the actions, and while it's doing that, I will jump back to the sequence. Find it here. As you can see here, I've added a pause around when it's partitioning the drives. So if you have an issue when the sequence cannot simply partition your drive, it could be because of third-party disk encryption, it could be because of something. If you add a pause in here, you can make sure that the sequence aborts at that step or stops at that step, and then you can hit F8, do a command prompt, and try to run disk part manually and see if that works. Because if that breaks too, well, then you have a problem. But then at least you know it's not config manager's fault. It's something else preventing you from doing that. You can check for drivers. The driver load command I did can be used not only to load the Hyper-V services, it can also be used to load network drivers and controller drivers on the fly if needed. If you expect or suspect the driver is wrong, you can try to load it manually and see if it actually works. All right. This script is a very complex script. No, it's not. It's just adding a pause. CDI win. CDI pause. There we go. It's simply creating a text file, or rather, it's looking for a text file. As long as that text file is not there, it will sleep. But if I create it, it will continue. So that allows me to create a pause that is not visible other than soon here on the progress bar. Any questions? Had you seen the Dart and VM Connect with config manager before? I think not. All right. Another script that you can use is a script that Michael Niehaus demonstrated yesterday in one of his sessions to simply quickly enumerate the variables that you've seen on the screen. But now you can see it says pause. And at that point, I could have pressed F8 and start to do stuff in my sequence. I can find at this point now the MDT packages folder. It's on the E drive. Packages. All scripts that you add to this package is being staged on the drive and is always available when we run the MDT sequence template. So I have a script that will enumerate the settings and just dump them to me at this point in the sequence. Not so useful to do to the screen, but more useful to actually dump it to a text file. And then you can open that text file, if you type correctly, in Notepad, and you can start reviewing the settings for your installation right now. So we can now see that, all right, we apparently it's desktop because all VMs are desktops. We have a hypervisor running. We are not running on battery. The current log path is this. When it's joining the machine into the Active Directory, it will store them in this OU, this amount of memory, settings, and so forth. So you can quickly see the current settings right now from this deployment. And as Niehaus demonstrated yesterday, I just would like to give you a heads up. Both the join account that you have and the network access account, those credentials are stored in clear text in these variables. So the F8 thing is really useful for debugging and troubleshooting, but it's not really meant for production. It's something you use when you develop and test your solution, not necessarily something you have in the overall. Yes, sir?
Did you say domain join as well?
Join account as well, sure. I think so. Well, it's not visible at this point. It was visible when it's using the account later on in the sequence. So you're correct. That's right. Good comment.
After that step.
After a step, yes, because it needs to read those prop values from the sequence. All right. So production, F8 away, test and lab, F8 on or available. Now, if you want to specify a value to have the sequence do something, I can use the tsenv command, and I can say, for example, slshare equals a logs folder. So I have a logs folder like that on my server. Because in my sequence, I had done something bad. It's called break sequence, and I'm running foo.vbs, which doesn't exist, so it will break. But I will set this value first. I would normally have that in my rules. Whoa. TSN. I think it's an XE. Here we go. This is, by the way, in the same folder that you have cmtrace now. So you can review the log files in cmtrace. So we try again. All right, finish with error code 1. Error code, sorry, 0, and 0 is good. So now we'll continue my sequence. Now that I have configured config manager, if something breaks, copy the log files to the server. So I will create that text file I previously had. So I will create the go.txt file. And the sequence will now continue and hopefully break. It broke. And as you can see, the machine will restart in 1400 minutes. That's a full day, full working day. Yes, sir? The comment is, if you set it to 0, yeah, it will set it to an obscene number. I don't remember the top of my head, but it's larger than the default WinP timeout, which is 72 hours. But if you guys have deployments running for more than 3 days, might stop using wireless networks. Yep. Anyway, it broke, obviously. Now, if I go back to my server, if I check in that folder, I will have a folder named after my computer, and in that folder, I will have the log files for this particular, where it is right now. If I would break the sequence later, I would have more files in here. Because if I, for example, it breaks during driver injection, I will also get the dissym log file here. So that can help me troubleshoot. You can do more. I wrote a script a year ago, I posted on my blog, that have the sequence mail me. Send me an email when it's done. That works, even in WinP, even in Windows. Or you can use status filters in config manager, because when a sequence is doing great, it will say 11.1.1.171. That's the success code when a sequence is successfully completed. And 70 is when it's not. So I can simply query the database for failed deployments like this. Yes, ma'am. Oh, very good question. Do I have to do it like I did? Set it in the command prompt? Absolutely not. What you will do is the following. In my boot file, you will add this in. Let me see. I have an example here somewhere. This is where you specify it in your settings package on the server. The reason this one didn't work is because I reset that when I launched my start monitor script manually in the boot image. So normally you don't need to worry. You just set that in the settings package and you're good. All right, good question. So in Config Manager, you can also create status filters. You can do this in 07 as well, so you probably know. But in this case, I created one for OS deployment, which is looking for the task sequence manager component, ending with this ID, meaning success. And if Config Manager receives this ID, that means I have a deployment that was correctly deployed, and now I can take an action. I can report it somewhere. I can even run a program. Send me a mail, send me a text, do something. Write it into an Excel spreadsheet, I don't know, pick one. But this allows you to keep track of things that are happening. You can also follow the same type of information in many of the reports. And you have to click the monitoring node to get to the reports. So some 424 reports in Config Manager 2012 by default, and a few of them are related to OSD. Come on. It's thinking. Lots. Let me try to narrow that filter down a bit. Here we go. Here you see all the task sequence related reports, 29 of them. And for example, you can review process of a running sequence, running deployment, and old sequences, and simply bring up reports of your current deployment as well. Can also be useful for troubleshooting because you can use them to drill into the process as well. But normally I try to turn to the log files instead. All right. I have two keyboards here, so I'm pressing the wrong one. Yes, sir?
Basically, if you still have that view running with notepad with the old variables, you could show the tsgb log path variable that shows exactly where your SMS gets logged.
That's a good comment. When I pull up the variables list, you can actually see the current log path in it, so that you can quickly find the current SMST's log file, because as we discussed before, it's moving around depending on something breaks. So yes, that's a good comment. Now, one of the most common issues around OS deployment is related to PXE. And PXE is not so much Config Manager's fault often if it breaks. It's often related to the network itself. I've seen some strange switch configurations out there. I've seen people trying to do PXE over WAN, and in general, that doesn't work very well. That boot image can be downloading for an hour, or then it suddenly breaks. But to do PXE in your environment, to avoid to have run around with a CD or a USB stick, guess what? PXE is about your only option. But this requires a few things of you. You need to put on your spending pants. Put in a $500 in each pocket. No, 100 at least. Because you need to be friends with a networking group. Take them out to a nice dinner. Buy them beer. Do something creative. Because if you don't have them on your side, forget about PXE and you are back to running around with CDs again. And when speaking of network configurations, of course, I mean, Pixie is not a very new protocol. It's been around for, wow, long, long time. But the most efficient way to get this to work is to use IP helpers on the switches. Specify on the switch level which Pixie server a specific client is supposed to use. Technically, you can use DHCP as well. And I'm pretty sure there are a few people in this room who are using it and it works great. And fine, if it works, don't touch it. But if you run into that, you have those 2% of the machines that never ever quite correctly Pixie boot, an IP helper will fix that. Because every Pixie ROM on the planet is supporting that. But not all Pixie ROM understands DHCP. Other from that, of course, you can be missing deployments on the server. And we will look into a very interesting thing about timeouts when we do Pixie deployment, especially if you are in the lab and you are testing config manager and you try to do many deployments repeatedly of a machine. You'll see some fun behavior there. But to understand Pixie, we need to understand that it's really about DHCP as a sort of a protocol standard. So in this example, I have a very simplified flow of a client and a normal DHCP server on the same network. So a client will like to have an IP address. Check. That request will go out to the network as a broadcast. Check. The DHCP server will pick up that request, respond with an address, and the client will eventually get it. Now, this is simplified, because if you pick up network monitor and do a trace, you will see it's actually a few more packets going back and forth until they agree on that IP address. So this is DHCP. But what if we put a client and a DHCP server on a different network, separated by switch or a router, different VLAN? Well, the client still would like to have an address. That request will still go out on the network, but there is no server on the local network that will pick up that request. So instead, the router, if you have IP helpers or relay agents configured, will pick up the request, forward it to the DHCP server, get the result back, get the IP address back, put it on the network, and the client will hopefully get it. So now, add Pixie into the picture. This is a very common configuration. You have a central DHCP server, and you have a few branch offices where you have clients and you have a Pixie server. Because again, Pixie over WAN normally doesn't work very well at all, unless you have these super high-speed WANs. I was visiting a customer not too long ago, and we started talking about network connections, and then they told me this is not a problem. And I said, all right, why? Well, our internet connection is 50 gigabit. Figure out what we have internally. I'm like, all right, never mind. Pretty good switches out there. But the client still requests an IP address. The address will go out on the network, the local network. The router will pick it up, but so will the local Pixie server, because it will act as a DHCP proxy. The difference is it won't hand out any IP addresses. So since it's local, it's most likely to respond soon. So the Pixie server will respond with telling the client, hey, I'm this Pixie server, this IP address, and you're supposed to have this boot file. Check. Now, that information goes to the client. The request goes to the upper DHCP server. It will hand back an IP address, the Pixie option, not specifying name and boot file again. And the client will now merge this information, and it will be able to Pixie boot. If you don't see these packages going over the wire, just find yourself a plain, dumb, old hub and connect your laptop at the same and the client at the same port, and just review the traffic. It allows you to quickly navigate and find out why isn't that information coming. Because you can filter on the ports or on the package types, and you can quickly navigate down. And then you have something that you can go back to the networking group and say, hey, the IP helper on this subnet is not correctly set, etc. So by understanding how it works in the background, it can help you troubleshoot it. So let's go on. Something to think about, if you are running DHCP and Pixie on the same box, make sure to select those boxes in the configuration console. Config Manager will not do that for you if you install it through Config Manager, but as I said on my session on Tuesday, I actually recommend not having Config Manager deploy your Windows deployment services. I actually recommend that you install that role first so that you can verify that it works as a core Windows deployment services role, and then you add the feature in Config Manager. It's easier to troubleshoot that way. But again, if it's not there and you select it in config, it will install it. All right. So let's go to the demo environment to do some Pixie booting. So I have a client with a legacy NIC in Hyper-V, and a legacy NIC is required to boot Pixie in Hyper-V. So I will start this one. And my deployments are available, so I will have to press F12. So I press F12 to start a network boot. And it starts downloading boot image through UDP over the network. If I abort this and try again, I can still do this, because Config Manager has not yet learned that this is a client about to Pixie boot. But quite shortly it will. As soon as the boot image has booted and the Config Manager sort of client has started, but when you start to select your sequences, the client will actually notify Config Manager about that. So in this case, on my server, while we are waiting for this to boot, my deployments that I have are, as you can see, configured to go to all unknown computers. That's a special collection that is only available if you check that box on the distribution point, meaning you go to the DP, Properties, Pixie, and you enable unknown. If you don't have that, you need to pre-stage all the machines into Config Manager before they are allowed to Pixie boot. And some customers like that, some customers, they just hate it. But it's yours that make that decision. All right. So if I go back to my client now, it's now starting the network. Yes, thank you. I actually set the password for Pixie. I think it makes sense. That's something you also configure in the properties I just visited or showed you. But without that, if you're using all unknown, where you're allowing every machine to Pixie boot, well, you better have a password. And you better not have mandatory deployments. It's called advertisements in 07. Can be quite dangerous. I saw in the forum post not too long ago a company who upgraded their data centers to Windows 7. Not very good. Anyway, I will select the sequence, and off my deployment goes. If I go back to my server now, if I go to my all systems node, you can see I now have an unknown object in here. And it will remain unknown until the client installs and give it a name, and you know the drill, and then it will end up as a machine later on. But what if now, if I take this machine and just kill it? Just revert the snapshot and try to Pixie boot again. Exactly. It's not a known anymore. It's coming. Soon. I'm waiting for the abort. Here we go, Pixie aborted. You might have seen that. On the server side, I have a log file. It's the SMS Pixie log. It's still available. It's in the SMS_CCM folder on your Pixie server. In this case, I have it on the same. But you can see it actually give you information and says, all right, this machine with this IP address, yada, yada, this MAC address actually was aborted. So you can see this info. So now I'm not able to Pixie boot again until I delete this object. And sometimes you will have 7 of these in here. And rather than trying to find the right one, just delete them all. It's not a problem unless they are sort of going deployments. So I will delete this record. OK, good. And I will try to Pixie boot again. How many think it will work? Pixie aborted still. Why? Cache, yes. What was the default cache in 07? 1 hour. How did you trim it in 07? Registry hack. What's the value? Cache expire. You set it to 120 or so, 2 minutes. You don't have to do that in 012. It will itself refresh within about 90 seconds. So if I go back to my server and wait for a while and review this log file again, within a minute or so, I will now see it's actually doing a maintenance job and cleaning out the cache. So if you just wait a minute or two after you have deleted the object, you can now go ahead and Pixie boot that machine again. So let us give it a while and go back to the distribution point settings. Because doing this, going to the DP, enable Pixie, that's not enough. You have to do something more. And I see this in the forums all the time. People simply misses this because that's new in Config Manager 12. You have to go to the boot image itself. You need to find them, and you need to make sure you have 2 of them, 32 and 64-bit. Even if you're only using this guy to deploy Windows, you still need to add them both because Config Manager is extracting the netboot files from it, which are required to start the Pixie boot. So you need to go Properties, and you need to go Data Source, and you need to select this one. And then you will actually be able to see both in the SMS Pixie log file and the dist manager log file that is actually extracting the netboot files from it. And they will then be put into the remote install folder. In the SMS boot, you will have 5 files in 32-bit, and you will have 6 files in 64-bit. If these files are not here, you can forget about Pixie booting. You need to have them both. So it's a quite easy step to troubleshoot. If it can't Pixie, if you get that TFTP53 timeout, check the files. And if possibly, recheck those boot images again. All right, let me go back to my log file here. Still nothing happened, but shortly we should be able to see it's actually doing a cleaning, and we should be able to Pixie boot that client again. Let me check the Twitter feed. Will the Startman and other scripts be available online? Yes, I will post them either today or tomorrow, so they'll be able for download. I just need to write a few instructions that goes along with them. All right. Need to get beer and cash for network folks. OK, that's good. There's a question about the third-party solution from 1E. I think that's a comment from one that actually works at 1E. Now they are talking about their Pixie Lite software, which allows you to Pixie boot from a client rather than a server that Config Manager normally requires. Well, I want to wait for this one to start, but shortly we should be able to boot that Pixie client again. We just need to wait that extra 30 seconds to make it go away. All right. I need to hide this keyboard. And apparently I hide it very well because I also shut down this monitor. Here we go. So, what about multiple sites? Well, in Config Manager 12, we don't need as many sites anymore. Because on the distribution point, we can now configure bandwidth control, which was the most common reason to do secondary sites before. So most of you are probably going to be able to reduce the number of secondaries you have out there and simply replace them with normal DPs, running either on a server or a client. But if you do the client, you don't get Pixie unless you buy third-party stuff, and you don't get multicast, which you get on the server side. Again, multicast also requires you to be friends with the networking group. And if you can't get that friendship, forget about multicast, because without the correct switch configuration, it can actually break more stuff than it's supposed to fix. So, will multicast help your deployments go quicker? Normally not, unless you're deploying hundreds at the same time. It's just more efficient for the network. The network load is less when you do multicast compared with unicast deployments. What are the reasons still to have secondary sites out there? Yes, sir, in the back. Exactly. If you have larger sites, when you start to go 300, 400, 500 clients at the branch office, they will report inventory. And if you have a secondary site, you can have them gather that inventory data and sort of send it in a more efficient way up to the primary site. Can there be another reason than just inventory data? So the comment, if I'm allowed to summarize it, it's basically you can use that for content routing to make sure that the packages flow the way you want them to be. That could be a reason as well. And it can also be for client push. If you want to be able to do client push on a specific site, yeah, it needs to be a secondary. But often these days, not so many people are doing client push. They normally have a startup script or another mechanism to deploy the client. But again, if you want to do client push, well, then you need a secondary site. You do require to have local Pixie servers, and there is another role that I normally recommend to have on at least the larger branch offices. It's not a secondary site, but it's a role that goes very hand in hand with distribution point and OSD. Which role? Which role am I thinking about? Yes, the SMP, the state migration point. Think of it as this. When you are replacing machines, and most companies are replacing about 20-25% of their machines every year, or at least they should. And a replace means that you back up one machine, but that backup goes to the SMP. And if that SMP is remote, problem. If it's local, better. So as long as your DP is protected, the SMP will use the same rules so that the clients locally will store the content on the local SMP. And then when you do the new machine, bare metal deployment, it will restore the backup from that SMP instead. You can also, if you have the UDI components, you can store the backup on a normal network share without SMP, or you can store it on a hard drive, for example, if it's a smaller site. But if it's a larger site, it makes perfect sense to also have an SMP available at the branch office. And that's just a simple site role to add. So it's not very complicated, but it also needs to be configured. So if I start off with the DP itself, this is a local DP, so I don't have the bandwidth tab. But if I would select another DP, you would see more tabs here that allow me to control bandwidth. Now, of course, you have boundary groups for site assignment and content deployment. But if you go to the state migration point, this is where you specify the folders on the server, on one or more drives, where you want to store the content. And you can also specify how many clients you're supposed to deal with and how much free space you should allow, or not allow, rather. And I also recommend changing the deletion policy, because the default is 1 day. Meaning, after a successful restore, and only after a successful restore, then the content is deleted. I normally like to have at least 1 or 2 weeks in the very event something goes wrong, because I can still manually get stuff from this content. All right. When you do replaces, I recommend to run a ghost job first. Create a sequence that runs the backup, but with the estimate switch for scan state. Because then you can learn how much data it will actually be using before you start migrate hundreds of machines. I had a customer back in Sweden a few years ago who tested to do the image deployment only. And they figured out, all right, on this network, we could do about 40 a day, and 40 a day will, well, 200 a week, and the project will take, this many weeks. What they didn't account for is that the average data they had locally was 7 gigs on average. So now you suddenly had 7 gigs that needed to go up to the server, a 3.5 gig image down, and now 7 gigs back. So they went from like 3.5 to almost 18 gigs. Their switches, they were lighting up as Christmas trees. There were no need for lighting in those rooms. They had to actually postpone the project because they didn't take height for how much data and replays actually cost. So that could be a good thing to pay attention to. All right. Me and Mr. Niehaus did a session on drivers on, was it Tuesday? Has to be Tuesday. So it's available as a recording. So this is sort of a 2-minute summary of the stuff you need to know to troubleshoot drivers in Config Manager. Not to use them, but to troubleshoot them, and that's the difference. So we have 2 types of drivers. We have the boot image drivers, and we have the OS drivers. And they are being dealt with differently. So let's go back to my demo environment again. Let me find a client and boot it into WinP. Voila, I have a client booted into WinP. It has not yet rebooted. How would I troubleshoot if this machine could not connect and start the deployment? Well, dead easy. You do an ipconfig. You try to ping the server. Normal style, basic troubleshooting for networks. You can try to do net use using the network access account and see if that works. But what if you run an ipconfig and it turns out blank? There is nothing. You're missing a driver. How can you troubleshoot that? Turns out that in this folder, there is a log file. It's called wp-init.log because wp-init is the component in config manager boot images that actually starts the network. So I can open this log file in Notepad, and I can see, let me get this out of the way, how much time it spent on installing the network components. I can see what device it was using, and I can also see the driver it actually tried to use to install that component. So that can sometimes give me information about, all right, why it didn't install it's the wrong driver. And then, if it doesn't have a driver, I can download it somewhere else where I have internet connection, put it on a USB stick, inject it in machine, and I can do driver load and point out the driver and run WPIN it again to see if the network starts now. Because sometimes when you go to a vendor site and look for drivers, you find 4 of them. And you don't know quite which that actually works. But you just put them on a USB, load them one by one, and the one that actually works, yeah, that's the one you inject in Config Manager. Yes, sir? The good question. Do I actually get the plug-and-play ID number? Yes. You have a very detailed log in the Windows in folder. It's called setupapi.dev.log. It's going to be a big one. But there you find all type of devices is tried to install with results as well. So that can also be helpful, even for WinP. This is normally something you troubleshoot for Windows, but it works in WinP as well. All right. So then we have the Windows OS driver. And to understand that, you need to know that Config Manager does 3 distinct steps when it's working with drivers. And it behaves differently, too. So if I go back to my Config Manager server, I find a sequence that I have with a driver in it. You can see I have 2 steps that inject drivers. One that is causing auto-apply. One is just applying a big package for this model in this case. But they behave differently. This one is doing plug-and-play. It has to find a match. This one is simply storing the driver into the driver store. So when we do deployments with Config Manager, there are 3 things that are actually happening. The first one is Config Manager somehow figures out the needed drivers. And this is differently depending on how you apply those packages. If you're using auto-apply, it's using plug-and-play ID detection. If you're using apply driver package, it will take them all. But one way or another, it will find out the drivers that are needed, and they are copied locally to the machine. That's the first thing that happens. Then, again, depending on action, a different command is being called by the sequence. And you can see this command inside the log file, but in the background, it's actually a DISM-like component that is being called to stage them into the store. And then, after the reboot, the normal plug-and-play service, in this case Windows Setup or Mini Setup, will actually install the driver. So this is the processes. And is there any point of troubleshooting these 2 if the driver is never copied or if it's the wrong driver being copied? No. So how do we troubleshoot this one? Well, can review the log file, of course, SMST's log file. And we can simply look at the drive. Search for the driver you were having problems with and see if it's there. Because if it's not, well, you have to go back to your sequence. You need to check over your packages and maybe your filters and whatnot. All right. So we assume the driver was actually copied, and then the sequence will try to inject them. Which log file now? This log. If you have the SL share enabled, that will actually be copied to the server as well, if it breaks after it tried to inject drivers. So that could be useful for logging. You can open it up in Notepad. It's not written for trace. But here you can see information about all the drivers it tried to load. And sometimes an error will pop up, and all right, this is why. There is another log file you can use as well, depending on how you use your image packages in config. That's a setup act log file. Can sometimes also give you information about what's going on. And the final step, all right, what to do if everything goes well so far, well, that's when we dive into this log file. Setup api.dev.log file. And to understand this, we need to understand ranking of drivers. Because sometimes when you open up such a file, let's see if I put one here. Yep. Sometimes you will see it's finding one matching driver in the store. And if it only finds one matching driver, there is no real argument about what driver that is going to be installed. But sometimes you will find other stuff. Well, that was 21, was a little bit. Let me see. Not so good. Oh, pretty good. Here we go. It apparently found 2 drivers that were matching. And of course, it picked the best one. It says right here, selecting best. So which one is the best? The information is right here. I don't have to scroll down. I know from here which is the best. So which is the best? Both are Microsoft. Both are inbox drivers. Which is the best? Top one or bottom one? Top one. Because the top one has a lower score. And lower in score means good. Or means good. If you look at this score, the first 2 characters is the type of signing of the driver. This means this is a certified driver. Certified Microsoft driver through the qualification labs. And a 00, when low is the winner, is pretty hard to beat. You have to go negative and it doesn't work. But apparently these 2 guys had the same. So that's not it. The second 2 is the feature score. Because vendors can write that information into the driver. If a driver doesn't have a feature score, it will be FF, which is a pretty bad value in hex when low score is the winner. So if you open up, for example, the Intel SATA device driver, they will have a feature score of 80, meaning lower, meaning better. So that's why a third-party driver will almost always win over an inbox driver, because it is signed, but it has a better feature score. And as you can see in this case, they had the same. So the distinction was actually the final 4 characters. That's how well they match the plug-and-play ID of the driver. Every device in Windows will have one or more, device IDs. And that's a bad example. Let me get a real card. Here we go. And a driver that is referencing this will have a better match than a driver referencing this. And sometimes, and very rarely, you are forced to make a driver better. I've done that about 3 times in my life, so it's not very often, but sometimes you have to. The problem is, if you change a single byte in an INF file, what happens? You break the signing, and you're suddenly ranked low again. So if you do a change, you need to sign it yourself. Create a certificate and sign it. And Windows 7 won't even install it unless it's signed. The 64-bit ones, 32-bit still does. But this is how you can figure out why it's picking a specific driver before another one. So helps you troubleshoot that. So in this case, it was the plug-and-play ID match that caused the top one to be used. So this is very helpful when you're trying to figure out why it says standard VGA adapter up here, even though you added your fancy ATI or NVIDIA driver package to it. All right. What about software updates? They fixed it. This was, for a long time, a quite big problem in 2007. But they finally released a hotfix last summer that prevented that timeout from happening when you did software updates and you had many of them. Now in Config Manager, we can do more things. On the image itself, and let me just jump to that. I haven't any on this machine, but I can show you where they are. When you right-click an image in your library, you can select Schedule Updates and inject updates offline into the image on the server. If you have the MDT integration, you can also use this one to install updates offline as part of the deployment process. This was a very common workaround back in those 7 days before the hotfix came to be. But my recommendation to you is try to keep your reference images at least somewhat up to date so you don't have that many patches that goes on when you actually deploy it, because it will just take an obscene long time to do it. It's better to have most of them in the image itself. But it's cool now that we can do offline servicing directly so the image is patched when we actually deploy it. Yes, sir. So the question is, can I use WSUS server? Supported? No. But I have a few customers who actually took the MDT lighted script and run that as part of the sequence against a normal WSUS server because they happen to like that. Now I would say that in 12, where you have the automatic approval rules, etc., which was their reason to use the WSUS, you don't need it anymore. If you want to have automatic approvals, you can have it. You don't need to have a standalone SUS for it. I would still recommend to create monthly packages, but if you're competing against WSUS, sure.
You need that WSUS when you build the image.
Exactly, you can use the WSUS when you're building the image. That's correct. Correct. A few final items. The error dialog timeout I showed you. On the sequence itself, if you're troubleshooting scripts, especially HEA scripts, if you're running them as part of the sequence, make sure to tick the disable 64-bit redirection. And this is also when you use an accessing COM objects, running PowerShell, etc., because it's in 32 and 64-bit too. Third-party disk encryption, painful with Config Manager, can be done, but it often involves a lot of work. And if you have questions around that, we have Mr. Alex right here in the front row is doing that a lot. But BitLocker works beautifully with Config Manager, even for refresh scenarios. I mentioned PowerShell. Make sure to launch the right provider in the right environment, and you need to set the execution policy for them both. Join domain issues. How do we troubleshoot them? Exactly. If the machine fails to join, find the netsepat log file, which is in the Windows debug folder, and review it. Because in that file, you will see exactly what account, exactly what OU, etc., and it will normally give you information about, all right, why it went wrong. What's the most common issue here? Machine object OU. There is a property that you can set in Config Manager when integrated with MDT that specifies the OU to put the machine in. It doesn't work unless you go to the sequence, find that step, and set it to something, anything, except computers container, but just something, because then the value that you specify will override it. If it's not set, it will not be reset to something else. And when you are testing and labbing, I recommend doing this, because the default behavior is this. So if you create a sequence, deploy it, it fails to join the domain, you have a local admin account that is disabled with a random password to it. Yep. Dart is back. Dart is king. Resetting the password. Locksmith. Great stuff. Or when you're testing, you enable this. You always have a local admin account that you can log into for troubleshooting. All right. This means that I published a few commandments for you. I won't read them out loud. They are in the slides. Seam trace is good, except for Wally. He still uses Notepad. Please remember to fill in the evals, and thank you, guys.